So people have asked me about party change. Did the parties really switch? Did they change? Did they realign? Why would they do such a thing? Some people don't believe it, but if you go back through history, the parties are completely different than what they were when they started. That they did change. You have to understand that what a party is a group of people that try to gain and keep power, get certain political values and ideas enacted in laws and practice. But as the leaders change, as society change with the needs of that particular society, the leaders of the culture and the people's desires, needs change, then the parties realign to accommodate that. When the parties don't change, then you get new parties. Let's start there. Today we're going to talk about the Republican Party, but we have to start talking about the Whigs. The Whig Party was the biggest rival of the Democratic Party in the 1800s until they never really consolidated on a issue of slavery. That was the issue of the day. What is the institution of slavery going to do? The Republican Party had a very distinct political opinion on slavery. They were anti-slavery. Most of them wanted to contain it and not let it move into the new territories as the country was expanding west and they were getting new states. But it also found a home for another collection of people called abolitionists. These abolitionists were passionately, almost morally and spiritually opposed to slavery and wanted to end it now. So the abolitionists kind of formed the more radical right now portion of the party. And the other people kind of form the moderate, will take steps to accomplish this portion of the party. The original Republicans that took over the Whig Party and kind of crushed it, they were expansionist. They were big government, big central government. Because if states do whatever they want, we are not going to have a real tight union of a country. We need the central government to be strong, to hold everything together, and where appropriate, local and state government can do what they want. They were also fairly big business. They were into industry and the Transcontinental Railroad, which, big business is something that, Republicans today still are very big advocates for. The original Republicans also were progressive where necessary. Think about that. Containing slavery in the American South, that is a regulation on a business, the cotton business, the tobacco business, etc. That's a regulation on a whole industry. Anti-slavery, big government, big business, expansionist, and progressive where necessary. That is your original Republican Party. Let's move. So, with the Civil War and how it went down and emancipation, the Southerners do not like Republicanism. And there's almost no chance for a big growth of Republicanism down south. Lincoln, who represented the moderate Republicans, unfortunately dies, and the president becomes Andrew Johnson, who is a Democrat, pretty much racist, but kind of angry at the Southern aristocracy. The beginning of Reconstruction was a mess. The 12-year period that we tried to reincorporate the South and reincorporate enslaved population, I guess it wouldn't be reinstate because it would just include the formerly enslaved population. There was a lot of good things that happened and there was some success, but ultimately it got cut short. It was way too short, and Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican from up north, in a very controversial election, a deal is made that allows Rutherford B. Hayes to be the president. He's a Republican, but the South wanted something out of it. Once again, right now they're very anti-Republican. They get Democratic control over all those states that were in question in that particular election, and they get the Union troops, the Northern troops, out of the South immediately. So what does that mean? Well, the radical wing of the Republican Party is pretty much dead. The moderate wing of the Republican Party, with the death of Lincoln, is kind of changing, and with Rutherford B. Hayes, it's not focused on the incorporation of African Americans. It's not focused on the little guy. Right now it's focused on big business, expansion, and some things that made the country stronger, but it abandoned some of its core values. What happened when the Northern troops were pulled out of the South because of this deal? That's where we get the rise of the Klan. That's where we get a lot of violence and lynchings. And the first few years after the Civil War, there was a lot of black politicians that went all the way to the federal level. There were congressmen and senators. And in many of those states, there weren't black politicians for the better part of the next century. Listen, with the radicals out of the way and people like Rutherford B. Hayes showing the South that, hey, we're not just going to beat you over the head because your old way of life was gone. We pulled the troops out. We're not all about, reincorporating black people. So let's fast forward all the way to McKinley. McKinley and Roosevelt. McKinley dies and Roosevelt continues many of his policies and beliefs. They were both very, very progressive. They wanted to control business. They didn't want business to get out of hand. They didn't want a recession like was experienced a few years before, where farmers grew too many crops, banks gave too many loans, businesses and manufacturing created so many products that the value of those products were worth nothing and the economy was kind of slow. So they felt that it was the government's job, don't do this, do more of that, kind of create regulations so business doesn't get out of hand and hurt the whole population. Roosevelt was the big trust buster. The trust buster that broke up monopolies and created almost the modern president with the type of power and the type of influence and popularity that he had. Roosevelt lets William Taft be the next president. William Taft was his vice president. They got along great. A lot of people thought that William Taft was just going to be his puppet, but actually William Taft wasn't. William Taft was even more progressive of a Republican. And he broke up some monopolies and put regulations on certain businesses that Roosevelt thought should be able to freely do whatever they wanted because they were creating jobs and they were helping the American economy. So Roosevelt said, you know what, I'm going to run against him. So the next election, Theodore Roosevelt runs against his former vice president and loses by a very small margin in the Republican primary. So Roosevelt said, yo, these guys will not support me after all I've done for the country. I've expanded the country, I've strengthened it, I have fixed the economy, I saved, a chunk of the environment, I did so much. He leaves the Republican Party and starts his own party that eventually becomes known as the Bull Moose or Progressive Party. And when Roosevelt, with all of his popularity and fame, leaves the Republican Party, the progressive wing of the Republican Party leaves almost altogether. He had one of the best third-party campaigns for president in all of American history. But him splitting the Republican Party allowed Woodrow Wilson to become our next president. And ever since then, when you think of progressives putting regulations on businesses, you kind of think Democrat. You kind of think Democrat because Roosevelt pulled them out of his old party and a lot of them settled in third parties and in the Democratic Party. Time marches on, and marches become popular. In the mid-50s through the early 70s, the civil rights movement, as we said before, Reconstruction period ended way too early, and almost a little less than a century later, some of these unfinished businesses have to be dealt with. Both parties try to be the party of the little guy while holding to their other values. And Eisenhower, Lyndon B. Johnson, signed civil rights legislation. But in the 60s, as the 60s push on, Hispanic migrant workers, sexual revolution, women's rights, and even opposing the very controversial Vietnam War become big issues. And it seems to many Americans it is too much change too quickly. When Dr. King dies in spring of '68, and then Democratic royalty, Robert Kennedy, dies in the summer of '68. Richard Nixon no longer has to appeal to the middle. He could veer right and stand on some of his values. The values that he believes people want are law and order. With so many protests and so many things happening and the moral, organized, intellectual backbones of the movement gone, he believes that he could stand on law and order. Too much change too quickly isn't good. We're going to have law and order, a return to normalcy in our country. And a lot of people of voting age are very, very interested in this message. Also, at this point, where the trickle of Dixiecrats, meaning Southern Democrats, dive into the Republican Party. For the next generation, we're going to see more and more Southerners switch parties for this reason. Slow change, hold fast to traditions, and let's establish law and order. And these messages are still very popular. In the 80s, when Bush runs, the law and order message was something that he played upon. The Will Horton commercial was very controversial, but it once again appealed to the law and order side of the party and helped him win. In the mid-70s, we have a movement. The Moral Majority is an organization led by Jerry Falwell. And Jerry Falwell kind of helps establish this religious right. The religious right aligns itself with the Republican Party, who at this time is standing for law and order and standing for traditional, slower change. And this fits in properly, because part of the religious right is, the whole schooling thing. Prayer in schools, funding for private schools, etc. And once again, the fear of just how drastically the role of women is changing through the 70s and the sexual revolution and widening values. This is something that is appealing to some of the Southerners. So this is when they change. This is when they change from Democrat to Republican in larger numbers. Now, Nixon had his successes and failures, but ultimately he's remembered for a handful of scandals. And that could have been very damaging to the party. But with his vice president and then his vice president's successor from the Democratic Party, Jimmy Carter, the country had some issues in the Middle East and some economic issues. So when a articulate, smooth-talking former actor, Ronald Reagan, shows up, he plays on, once again, traditions. And he actually creates the Make America, Let's Make America Great Again slogan. Let's get you back to work. Let's get peace in the Middle East. And it works. Let's bring it to modern times. When you see a Republican Ronald Reagan handed off to Republican George Bush, it's because there was good economic times. When you see Republican George Bush handed off to Bill Clinton, it's because of bad economic times. And then when you see George W. Bush handed off to Barack Obama for the same reason. But through both Bushes and Barack Obama, what you see is, once again, a change in society. More mechanization and more equipment means there's less on-the-ground migrant labor jobs. There's less menial labor jobs. The people who depend on those type of jobs and careers for their livelihood are in greater and greater competition. Ever since the late 60s, this has been a small political issue, especially in the Southwest. Cesar Chavez, etc., look for political legislation for rights. When illegal immigration becomes a problem, especially in the American Southwest, many of these citizens look to the government to create laws and systems that can help them. When a bipartisan coalition, the big things have to be bipartisan. When a bipartisan coalition gets together and creates a plan that just kind of merges both of them together, many people in the Republican Party look at that as a betrayal. The things that I valued most were left out of this compromise. You guys are flirting and sleeping with the enemy. A stronger border control over amnesty and citizenship, and also an anti-establishment, anti-in-the-system value grows. Once again, this is what leads to a lot of candidates running that don't have a big political background. People who are just businessmen or surgeons or what have you ran. So there you have it. The Republican Party in the early 2000s are still big business and industry. They are very tight on immigration and want border control number one.
They have
more traditional values, and they advocate for slower social change. They are no longer progressive, they're more fiscally conservative, and would like to give capitalism its fair reign and let businesses do as they please. Let me know what you think. Thanks for your attention. We'll be coming to you with an evolution of the Democratic Party as well. Be good to yourself.